I was born in Houston, raised in Dallas. Juneteenth was always a very present holiday. I didn't necessarily know what that meant. I understood it as like the Black 4th of July.
In the firmament of all of our cultural observances, Juneteenth wasn't that big a thing in Virginia, and even less so in New York.
Slavery was not discussed in the household, and it certainly wasn't taught in the schools.
A friend of mine who had first learned about Juneteenth did so through the news, and she was shocked by it, and she had texted me and said, I can't believe that this is something I never learned about, and did you know about Juneteenth? I of course did, and I explained to her how I learned about Juneteenth.
Since the year 2000, I've been aware it's Juneteenth. Let me get myself into somebody's church this Sunday, or let's see if there's some kind of special thing going on.
As a young adult, I moved to Texas, and within a year or two is when I started to hear about Juneteenth, and I started to discover this history. And the thing is that's ironic is that I had actually studied U.S. and Latin American history in college, and again, had never heard about Juneteenth. So moving to Texas really opened my eyes.
In thinking about Juneteenth, I decided to look up Major General Gordon Granger's General Order Number 3, which he read to the freed people of Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865. And it reads like this: "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and former slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere."
The thing about Juneteenth that I think is interesting is that it wasn't the most common celebration of Emancipation Day. The most common was January 1st, the date of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and there are incredible descriptions of that from Frederick Douglass and all kinds of other people, because those celebrations started on January 1, 1863, and they're incredibly well documented. Big, organized celebrations, because it was anticipated. There was a preliminary proclamation, so they knew it was coming. People were waiting at the telegraph office to relay the news that it was actually signed and official.
My family has a kind of special connection to Juneteenth, in particular to Juneteenth in Texas. I'm fortunate that my partner really took it upon herself to study and explore and investigate African American history in Austin, Texas. And through her research and interviews and so forth, she was able to uncover the original site of the first Juneteenth celebration in Austin, Texas, which is actually the site of the Rosewood projects in Austin, which were one of the very first housing projects in the United States.
Juneteenth was a term that I first heard when I was sitting squirreled up in the library at Harvard University, looking for the obscure publications of Ralph Ellison. His story of 1965, I discovered in about 1970, 71. And I can remember patting my feet and shaking my head as I read this story, which is really a rendering of a performance of a sermon, Juneteenth. But that was my first encounter with it.
In terms of Juneteenth recognition, last year in 2020, the year of the George Floyd, killing, during the pandemic, there seemed to be an explosion of creative expression around Juneteenth. And on that day, I actually had a couple things happening. One, I participated in a number of art openings, but two, participated in a march and a protest that was orchestrated by artists. And it was, it included multidisciplinary artists, musicians, performing artists in terms of the theater, as well as visual artists.
2020 was a tipping point to some degree because the activism really started when Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman and when Zimmerman was set free by the courts. So what you see now is 7 years of this iteration of athletic activism, particularly those really pushed by black athletes. And so in doing the work of amplifying and supporting and doing the mobilizing work around Black Lives Matter, around the need to protect the vote in the More Than a Vote campaign, for example, the convergence of those forces allowed the space for this holiday, which has always certainly been celebrated since emancipation, to become this moment of galvanized political energy. And I think that's how we understand Juneteenth's role in that, in the summer, the incredible summer of athletic activism and activism in general in the United States in 2020.
My plan for celebrating Juneteenth this year is to do some sort of activity in Harlem. And I do know that there tend to be a lot of special events and usually readings. The readings of works by Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison, and I'm hoping to partake in that.
The mood of the day for me is one of jubilation. It really is around celebration. It is about, reading about the day, talking about the day, and really thinking about what it means to be a descendant of enslaved peoples in America and how far we've come.
From a personal perspective, my favorite part about Juneteenth and just really any holiday is food. I always look forward to eating, especially when I go back home. That's the best part. My mama's peach cobbler is one of the best things. She passed away when I was in middle school, and so a few of the aunts have tried to replicate it, some more successful than others, so I'm excited for that.
Martin Luther King Day is now an institution in our country, and I think we have an opportunity to make Juneteenth one of those sorts of institutions that is doing something a little different than Martin Luther King Day, right? Martin Luther King Day really highlights, right, civil rights activism, right, political activism. I think Juneteenth should, as a national holiday, and here even locally, as it is, as we see even here in Harlem already, it is a cause for celebrating the institutions, the community institutions that enable Black and other marginalized communities in this city to survive. And this is going to be very important as we move through this pandemic moment, right?
You don't have to know a lot, I think, if you're at all a progressive-minded and inclusive person, to say that if the Declaration of Independence was one of the founding days and documents of the United States, then the emancipation of enslaved people, when they finally got to share that claim on being a free American with those equal rights, how can that not be regarded as an equally founding moment? So I think for better and for worse, in many ways maybe for better, we're in a moment where that's an open contest and people's vote is going to be publicly noted. And so I just think there's a lot of energy behind it, and some of that energy seems to be focusing on Juneteenth. Like, let's come together as a country and recognize that this was an important day, not just for the descendants of enslaved people in the United States, but for all of us who are Americans who think that the Declaration of Independence meant something and has to mean something in the future.
This is a really opportune time for non-white folks to do coalition building and to really come together and say that we have this shared history, whether you are Latinx, whether you are Afro-American, whether you are South Asian, like if you're not white or you're not very light-skinned and white passing, like you have an experience that is very unique in America, that you know what it is to feel othered, to feel like you don't belong, to walk through this world feeling as though you have something to prove to other folks. And so I think, again, more broadly, Juneteenth is about not just embracing the history of Black Americans, but embracing the history of non-white folks in general in this country and saying, hey, we have to band together and really honor and acknowledge that we do have this shared history of facing discrimination, facing some form of racism, harassment, and some form of othering, some form of feeling as though we are inferior or less than simply because of the color of our skin.
The great physicist, Professor Barad, says, with a nucleus, we can blow up the Earth. But we can also recognize an entire network of life in a single atom. in a single nucleus of an atom. If we can recognize our oneness, and as Glissant says, give consent to the fact that we are the same people, that I am you and you're different from me, that makes us still part of a unity that we all share, then I think the Juneteenth celebration will take off for everybody, and not just be the black thing that we identify with, but the human thing that we all have to strive for.
I'm pleased that Columbia is recognizing this day, first of all. And last year, I was quite surprised because it brought back into focus, the opportunity to really start to have dialogue around it. And I think by having this day as a day of recognition, I think it starts to instigate dialogue. So I would hope that Columbia would start a dialogue around what this means. And it goes back to the point I made about this being an Independence Day of sorts, but really talking about really what does independence really mean for the formerly enslaved.
Our recognition of this holiday nationally comes after global protests after the murder of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of so many others. That's just to mention the year 2020. And so there's almost disconnect between a celebration of something from 150 years ago, which actually didn't quite materialize. All the dreams of freedom didn't quite happen the way we had hoped. But then also, one is left struggling to understand how Juneteenth speaks to the current moment. That one wonders, will it take another how many decades before we can celebrate freedom from structural racism, from police brutality and murder, from crippling debt that, really preys upon the poor of all colors, but particularly black communities. One wonders in one's darker moments, maybe it'll be on June 20th when we have to make, maybe we'll forget this for one day, but one wonders, how long will it be that freedom actually is truly realized? Happy Juneteenth.